Hi, I'm Sherry Coleman Collins, registered dietitian nutritionist and food allergy expert. I'm also a consultant to the National Peanut Board. I'm so excited to be with you today. Thank you for the opportunity to share this information virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm thrilled that technology allows me to be with you this way. Today, we're going to be talking about managing food allergens in schools. Let's dive right in. I also want to say, as I share the learning objectives, that if you have questions about the content that I've shared, there will be information at the end. My contact information is on the last slide. And although I'm not there to answer your questions or take a Q&A, I'm happy for you to reach out to me directly with questions you may have about this content. So here are our learning objectives. First, we're going to talk about the importance of nutrient-dense foods like food allergens, these commonly allergenic foods, in the school nutrition program. We're also going to talk about what the evidence says regarding handling potential allergens in school meals so that you'll feel more empowered to serve these foods. I'm also going to share some resources where you can learn more. This is going to be a short training, and there's a lot to learn. So I'm going to share with you some great resources and places you can go after this presentation in order to learn more. So first, why do we need to keep these foods in the diets of young children? I think that, it goes without saying, and you are an important part of this effort to help feed growing children nutrient-dense foods. There are so many options out there for kids, and as you know, the school nutrition program helps to meet a critical need during a time when children are growing. And you'll see in the box on the left a bulleted list of allergens. These are the most commonly allergenic foods in the US, and you'll see on the right a list of nutrients. Now, every food on the left doesn't contain every nutrient on the right, but they contain many of those nutrients on the right. Many of those nutrients are found in the foods in this list. And you can see that these are critical foods for growing children. Protein is one of the most important, of course, and many children don't eat enough protein. Not all children, but many children don't eat enough protein. And so these are foods that can help fill that gap. They also provide B vitamins, which are important for growth and cellular division, including B12, which is one of those nutrients that's primarily found in animal sources of protein. But it's also found in some of the other foods here, either through fortification or naturally. And then nutrients like calcium, magnesium, and zinc, these are foods that we know that kids often aren't getting enough of. And these foods can provide some of those important nutrients. Folic acid and folate is another, and choline is one of those nutrients that we don't talk about very much, but is really important for brain and eye health, and it's found in eggs primarily. Omega-3 fatty acids are an important part of growing healthy children and brain development and brain health, as well as vitamin E, one of those nutrients that's really found heavily in nuts and peanuts. So we want to make sure that we're not eliminating these foods, and that in fact, we're encouraging children to eat these foods because they provide a wealth of nutrition, a host of really important nutrients that kids need when they're growing. So what about food allergies? And this is obviously my area of expertise and interest, and it's an area where I find that people have a lot of misinformation. So as we go through this presentation, I'm going to share with you some basic facts about food allergies. This is a slide that I think answers many of the most common questions that I get. The first is about prevalence. I get questions all the time about, why are there so many kids with food allergies now? And there used to not be children with food allergies at all. Or when I was growing up, I didn't know anybody with food allergies. And I think that that's a great question, and it's certainly the million-dollar question. First of all, it's important to recognize that the prevalence of food allergies is somewhere between 6 and 8% in children, and it's up to 10.8% in adults. Now, these numbers are self-reported or reported by parents. So they're not all, they haven't all been verified by a physician, but this gives us an idea of how many people have food allergies. And I think it's important to recognize that this isn't as high as many people think. If you ask a general population, how many people do you think have a food allergy? They'll say something like 20% or 25% usually. And these numbers are far lower than that. It doesn't mean that the issue isn't important. It certainly is important. But I think that it puts it into proper context, recognizing that most children can eat all kinds of food and they don't have restrictions around food allergens. The other thing is that it is costly to have food allergies. It's costly in terms of finances and healthcare usage and in psychological measures. There's a lot of research coming out that shows that having a food allergy significantly affects quality of life. So this is important when we think about diagnosis and the importance of not self-diagnosing. There's also a lot of confusion over true food allergy versus other adverse reactions to foods. And I think that's why we see that when we ask people how many people have a food allergy, their numbers are much higher. They say much higher number. They think they have a food allergy, or they think they know someone with a food allergy. But there are lots of other conditions that may impact digestion that are confused with food allergies often. And this is why self-diagnosis is not good when it comes to food allergies. And some research shows that 50 to 90% of people who diagnose their own food allergy are wrong. There's also an issue around reduced empathy for people who have true allergies, when there are people who say they have allergies but don't really have allergies. Because a lot of times if people say they have an allergy, their behavior may not always reflect the fact that they have a true allergy if they don't have a true allergy. So they may say that they're avoiding something, but a little bit is okay. That can be confusing when someone has a true allergy. They can't eat any of the food that they're allergic to, not even a small amount. The other thing is that school bans may increase adverse risks for children with food allergies. This is something that it seems counterintuitive, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in a moment, but it is important to recognize that banning any food in the school environment doesn't necessarily protect children from that allergen. And then an important newer development is that prevention works. We can actually prevent many cases of food allergies through early introduction of allergenic foods, including peanut foods. I'm not going to talk about that in this presentation, but I'll point you to a resource which is called preventpeanutallergies.org. It's a website that the National Peanut Board has developed that has great information on this topic if you want to learn more. So what is a food allergy? Well, a food allergy is an immune reaction. It's IgE mediated. That means that our immune system recognizes an allergen as a foreign invader, as something that needs to get out of the body. So the body thinks this food is not good. It doesn't recognize it as food. It recognizes it as a pathogen. And then the body reacts with all kinds of symptoms. And I'll show you some symptoms here in a moment. It's important to know that the reaction for food allergies, a true IgE-mediated food allergy, usually happens pretty quickly. It often happens within minutes, but it can take up to 2 hours to have a reaction. If a reaction is outside of that window, it's probably not an IgE-mediated food allergy. It also happens every time a food is eaten. You know, that's something that I think is important to recognize is, you know, people can't just eat this food one time and be fine and then eat it again and have a reaction and then eat it again and be fine. That's not what a food allergy does. There are some differences with people who have milk and egg allergy where they may be able to eat baked milk or egg, but they can't tolerate it when it's not baked. But those are very unique cases, and that's an individual example. In general, it's important to recognize that if somebody has a food allergy, they cannot eat the food that they're allergic to. And then importantly, sensitization doesn't always equal true allergy. So sometimes people might test positive on a blood or a skin test, but that doesn't mean they have a food allergy. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment as well. And in fact, it's right here. So when we think about diagnosing a food allergy, you know, the most important part of diagnosis is history. So actually having had a reaction to the food should preclude any testing that's done later on. So someone who's never had a reaction to a certain food shouldn't get a blood or a skin test to that food, because the chances are they may have a positive blood or skin test even without having any true allergy. And that's because some people will create IgE to certain foods, but they'll never have clinical symptoms, right? They'll never have any symptoms of food allergy. And in that case, it's considered a false positive. So if they don't have any symptoms when they eat the food, even if they have a positive blood or a skin test, they don't have a food allergy. Now, the other way isn't necessarily true. So if someone has a negative test, then they probably don't have a food allergy. So it's very good at predicting the negative, but it's not as good at predicting the positive. The gold standard for diagnosing a food allergy is an oral food challenge, where an individual actually eats the food that they think they're allergic to in a clinical environment where they're monitored by medical professionals, and then observe to see if they have any objective symptoms. So that's the gold standard for diagnosing a food allergy, but unfortunately, it doesn't happen as often as it should. So what are the symptoms of a food allergy? Here is a really good, I think, succinct look at what kind of reactions can happen with a food allergy. And this is from the website foodallergy.org that's managed by FAIR, the Food Allergy Research and Education Organization. And you can see here that there are a lot of different kinds of symptoms that can happen. Some are mild, some are severe. together, even severe or a group of mild symptoms together can actually be a very important and urgent matter, right? So it can be an emergency, even life-threatening reaction. So oftentimes reactions start in the mouth, right, with itching, swelling in the mouth and then in the throat. And those can be a sign of a very serious reaction, or they can be a mild symptom that goes away pretty quickly. Other reactions can include things like digestive upset, right? Vomiting, diarrhea are not terribly uncommon. And then things like hives are pretty common, but not all severe reactions have hives. So it's important to recognize even without hives, someone can be having a food allergy reaction. The most severe kind of reaction that can happen with food allergies is called anaphylaxis, and the only treatment for that is epinephrine. It's important to recognize that children with food allergies should have a food allergy reaction plan on site, so an anaphylaxis reaction plan on site at the school, so that people who are charged with their care know how to treat a reaction if it happens. So this is the big 8, and I showed this to you a few minutes ago when I was talking about nutrient-dense foods, and you can see here, these are foods that are everywhere in our society. They're foods that are probably in your schools now, and they're foods that, again, provide lots and lots of nutrition for children, but they also are responsible for about 90% of food allergy reactions. And to this list of 8, I would add sesame as well. So sesame is probably the 9th most common food allergen, and we expect to see some labeling law changes that will include sesame in future requirements around food allergen labeling. But what other kinds of reactions can cause similar symptoms to food allergies? Well, these can be things like non-IgE mediated allergies or allergic syndromes. So eosinophilic esophagitis is like a chronic swelling in the throat that can be very uncomfortable and scary, and even sometimes dangerous for people who have this condition. FPIES, which is a food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome, that typically affects young children under school age, so not too many kids come to school with this condition. Oral allergy syndrome is one that you might be hearing a lot about or even experiencing right now because of all the pollen in the air. It's actually a cross-reactivity with pollen. It isn't like a food allergy that causes all those other negative syndromes or symptoms, and it isn't something that typically causes a life-threatening reaction. Oops, go back. And then, of course, there are intolerances. You guys are probably familiar with lactose intolerance. Of course, it's one of the most commonly requested dietary modifications in schools. And then things like celiac disease, which is really more an immune condition. It's not really a food allergy, but it requires strict avoidance very much like a food allergy does. So now, how do we manage these situations? You know, I've talked a lot about keeping these foods in the diet, keeping them in the schools, and why we should do that. I think the other thing I didn't really mention that I think is important as well is that it's very affordable. And for most students, these are foods that are very highly acceptable, right? Kids love peanut butter. They love milk, especially chocolate milk. You know, they love all of these different foods. And we want to keep them in the diet because they provide all this nutrition, but not all children can have these foods, right? So they're an affordable, delicious, nutritious, acceptable option for the majority of your students. But for those students who can't have it, we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep them safer. So let's talk about how to manage these allergens. And in this topic, in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about some research or some recommendations that came out specifically during the pandemic to help schools who were feeding children in different kinds of environments, right? But the meat of this applies to all year long, right? It doesn't necessarily only apply to pandemic feeding. It's actually all the time. These are really good recommendations. So this is a study or a consensus document that was published in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology, and it was written by allergists, and it was written by allergists who specifically work on school nutrition or school food allergy management programming. And you can see here that they made 8 recommendations that I think are really clear and helpful. And the first one is washing hands, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. Washing hands, cleaning surfaces, and not sharing foods. This is like the #1 most effective way to help keep children with food allergies safe, right? Enforcing hand washing before and after meals, cleaning surfaces before and after meals and not allowing children to share food will significantly reduce the risk of cross contact, accidental ingestion, all of these things that we don't want children with food allergies to come into contact with. And also, they're a much more hygienic way to encourage, communal eating. So whether you're eating in the classroom, you're eating in the cafeteria, these are practices that just keep everybody safer. When we think about reducing cold and flus, I mean, it's incredibly effective for that as well. The second one that I think some people were surprised about, not people like us, not people in the food allergy or in the allergy community, but some people in the community of school nutrition, is that these experts actually came out and said, food allergen bans are not medically necessary. There are a lot of questions about exposure through the air or, just being near an allergen. And I can tell you that the research is very convincing that allergens don't just float around in the air in general in a way that causes a significant reaction. Ingestion is what is required for causing a severe reaction. So you have to actually eat the food. It doesn't necessarily have to be a huge amount, but you do have to eat the food in order to have a severe reaction. So just sitting near somebody, for instance, eating a peanut butter sandwich isn't going to cause a person with a food allergy or with a peanut allergy to have a reaction. They may feel stressed, they may feel uncomfortable, but it isn't going to cause them to have anaphylaxis. And I think that's a really important part of understanding how we can manage these allergens. So food allergen bans are not medically necessary. The third one is ADAPT 504 plans to work with new school restrictions. So when schools were feeding in the classroom, or when schools went to feeding in other places in the building, or when schools went to universal feeding, those impacted those with food allergies, individuals with food allergies, and we need to modify our food allergen plans for that. So that's a very individualized recommendation, and I think that different schools are going to do that in different ways. Stalking epinephrine. Epinephrine is the only treatment for anaphylaxis, and most states either allow or require schools to maintain non-student specific epinephrine in their schools. And if you have it, you need to know where it is, who's allowed to administer it. People should be trained. There are lots of things that go around that sort of to make stock epinephrine effective. We also have to think about when children are in the building, but the school nurse might not be in the building, or the person who's trained might not be in the building. And is that stock epinephrine locked up? So there are things that we have to keep in mind around stock epinephrine, but I think having epinephrine in the school, if possible, is an important part of making kids with food allergies safer. And then training all school personnel to recognize and treat anaphylaxis. I just can't say enough about training. And you guys do such a great job of training, and you do so much training, but food allergy training is an important part of that. It should be at least provided annually. I was always a fan of providing it twice a year, if possible, once at the beginning and then once in the middle of the year, so that when you have new staff come or people just forget, right? I think we get so much training, especially in back to school, right? Back to school training is intense, and there's a lot to learn, and a new menu and new students and new staff. And you can't absorb everything. So getting an additional sort of booster in the middle of the year for food allergy training is a great way to make sure that school personnel are ready. And this isn't just for school nutrition. This is really everybody in the building. A zero tolerance for bullying. There's good research that shows that children with food allergies have to deal with significant amounts of bullying, and that's not okay. No bullying is okay, right? We should have a zero tolerance for all kinds of bullying, but it's important to recognize that food allergies is a place where we see significant amounts of bullying, and schools need to have a plan to deal with that. There is a good recommendation as well about unique approaches might be necessary in some schools and classrooms. So depending on the allergen, depending on the individual's issues, there could be a requirement or a need to do some other creative approach for managing food allergies. And we'll talk a little bit about what kinds of accommodations might help as we go through the presentation a little further on. And then lastly, communication is paramount to ensure success. I have some more information and thoughts on communication coming up. So I talked about cleaning hands and surfaces, and remember that's the #1 recommendation in that document that I just shared with you. It's important to know that sanitizer does not remove proteins from surfaces. Sanitizer, I always used to tell my staff and my team, sanitizer just makes for clean bugs or clean bacteria, clean protein, not bacteria. It does kill bacteria, but it makes for clean protein. So proteins are not alive, right? So the protein that's in food that causes food allergy reactions, it's not alive, so you can't kill it. You have to actually remove it from the surface, whether that's hands or surfaces like tables and prep tables. So what does work? We know that household and industrial cleaners do a great job of removing proteins from surfaces. Washing your hands with soap and water does a really good job of cleaning proteins off. And then disposable wipes actually work really well. So those wipes that you wipe your hand with and throw them away, those work really well as well. And I mentioned to you that document said that bans are not medically necessary. I would also say that they're not a best practice. They actually don't necessarily keep children with food allergies safer. It creates a false sense of security. It really makes people think that the allergen is not in the environment, and that isn't necessarily true. It's impossible for us to check every single lunch that comes into the building, to check the label on every single item that comes into the building. And no one should have to do that. We need to create policies that actually keep kids safer. It doesn't address all potential allergens. So we know that peanuts and tree nuts are the most commonly banned foods, but what about other food allergens? Milk and eggs are more common in young children, and we know that those are becoming more, they're sticking around longer. So children who have food allergies, or milk and eggs specifically, in their preschool age are keeping those allergens longer throughout their life. So we want to make sure that that we're providing an equitable protection, right? So children who have milk and egg allergies may be even at higher risk because those foods are still in the environment and no one seems to take them quite as seriously as they do nut allergies. It also requires that other people follow the policy. I can't tell you how many times I have met people who told me that their school or their daycare or their whatever environment they're in is supposed to be peanut free, but they still bring the food. People are knowingly bringing the food into the environment. And I always tell them, please don't do that, because the people who do have allergies think the allergen isn't there. But I think that it underscores the importance of recognizing that these policies that require other people to follow the policy, who may not be invested in it, may not be the way to keep children safer. And we already talked about the not medically necessary. So what kind of accommodations should we do? And I think, these are some really good options. One thing to know is that USDA requires accommodation for food allergies, right? But they don't require bans. Bans aren't necessarily required. What they say is that reasonable accommodations are required, and that has to be reasonable for the school. It has to actually be doable too. As we've already talked about the banning, it's almost impossible to actually do that. So number one, always offer a safe option. And I know from working in school nutrition, I'm not sure I mentioned that, but I did work in school nutrition in Georgia. And I know that you are offering safe options, making sure that you're going through the menu and ensuring that there are safe options for students with food allergies is an important part of your job, and you're already doing that. But you may not always be communicating that to the families that are sending their children to your school who have food allergies, especially multiple food allergies. Sometimes those require a little bit more effort. Providing allergen-safe areas, separate tables in the cafeteria or classroom may be necessary. We've talked about washing hands and not sharing food. I'm a big fan of non-food rewards and celebrations. I think that that's just really a great way to include everyone. And then, of course, age-appropriate accommodations. You have to think about the maturity of the child as well. I promised to share with you some resources, and here they are. The CDC has a great toolkit called Food Allergies in Schools, and you can get that information just by Googling it. I'll also share a PDF of this presentation, and you can access it there. The School Nutrition Association has a food allergy resource center that has good FAQ and lots of webinars for you and your staff. And then FAIR and FACT are two advocacy organizations that have great resources. And I think I already mentioned peanutallergyfacts.org, but that's another resource that the National Peanut Board has created for you as well. And I talked about communication. I think that communication is essential. One thing that I really encourage school nutrition professionals to do is to reach out first. Don't wait for the parents to reach out to you. If you get information from the nurse that says you're getting a child who has food allergies, go ahead and make the first move. Reach out to the parents, let them know that you're available, be willing and able to talk about your program, your training, the things that you're doing. Be empathetic. Of course, recognize that the parents are afraid. Oftentimes the school is the first place that these children ever go outside of their parents' reach. And so they're scared, and you need to recognize that. Get to know the child or the children. Make sure that you're communicating inside your building and outside your building. Make sure that food allergen information is available for anyone who wants it, who needs it, that it's in print and online, and of course at the point of sale as well. So I just want to share a couple of things with you from schools that we know, from directors we've talked to and worked with, who went from peanut-free to allergen aware. So they previously they had not been serving peanuts, and now they are serving peanuts. So how did they do that? You know, I worked with a director in Pennsylvania, and he had a great story about how, you know, his schools had been peanut free, and he thought that was kind of what they had to do in order to keep children with peanut allergies safe. But now he says that his schools are not peanut free, and in fact, neither are yours. Even if you're saying that they're peanut free, he knew that even though their schools were supposed to be peanut free, there was still peanut in the building. There were still people bringing it in who either staff or students that you just can't catch every single episode or every single meal that has a peanut or tree nut in it. And so he shared with his team and with the building administrators and with the school nurse that the research doesn't show that this actually creates a safer environment, that it may create a false sense of security. He asked them, or said to them, you know, sure, maybe the kitchen's peanut-free, but is the building? Some research shows that most reactions happen in the classroom, not in the cafeteria. So I think that's an important part of our story or our message around food allergies as well. So how do directors go about making these changes? Well, the first thing is that stakeholder support is key, right? So parents need to be on board, nurses need to be on board, administrators need to be on board. And you might be surprised that the majority of parents who have children with food allergies don't want bans. You're always going to have some, or you might have some in your community who do, but the majority probably don't. They want their children to learn to manage their food allergen in an environment where there's a safety net, right? And the school provides that, both with nurses and with staff that's caring and trained to help with food allergies. The other thing is that, you know, it's important to recognize, and this is what other directors have told us, is that it's important to recognize what's best for everyone who has every different kind of food allergy. I got a call recently from a director who was in a district that where they'd been asked to ban eggs from a school. No eggs in the school because of an egg allergic student. And so we have some great conversation about what is the true risk versus perceived risk, and how can they communicate that to the parents and to the staff as well. I think that it's important to recognize as well that, you know, it's not just about preventing reactions, but it's also about supporting social and emotional health. Remember, I talked about bans and about quality of life. And I think that if we create solutions that are evidence-based, then we end up with solutions that actually support emotional and social health and also keep children with food allergies safer. So here's a list of some things from some of my friends in school nutrition who have implemented what works and what may not work and why. You know, so we've talked about a lot of these. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but I think that, again, goes back to, you know, some of those key things that if we can focus on proper hand washing and cleaning of surfaces and policies that actually keep children with food allergies safer, then we have a better solution at the end of the day. And so as we wrap it up, I just want to share with you some key takeaways. You know, number one, be aware of the impact of food insecurity on your students with food allergies. This is something that we didn't talk a lot about in this presentation, but it's important to recognize that many of the allergenic foods that I listed are also foods that are very affordable, and they're foods that help ensure that kids inside school and outside of school have access to nutritious foods. Create a food allergy management plan based on best practice in science. You know, I think that I'm a big fan of evidence. What does the evidence tell us? And we can lean into that when it comes to food allergy management. Provide clear and concise communication. And again, that's inside the building and outside the building. And make sure that you're working with all of the key stakeholders. And then the last thing is to be prepared for reactions, because even if you do all the right things, you may still have reactions in your schools, because children make mistakes, adults make mistakes. Sometimes first reactions happen in schools, and you need to be prepared when reactions happen. So with that, I will again say thank you so much for allowing me to be with you today. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation and that you learned something new. This is my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out if I can answer any other questions that you might have outside of this presentation. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to be with you. Enjoy the rest of your conference.